So, hello, my name is Professor Kristian Lasslett. I'm a criminologist here at Ulster University, and my area of expertise is white collar crime. So, I look at crimes that are largely committed by very powerful actors sitting in seats of corporate power and state power. Fortunately, there's a lot of it. It goes on frequently in all countries. Um, it's rarely prosecuted, and it's an endemic problem that's really affecting the future of the world as we currently know it. And I think COVID is a tempestual reminder of that. We have something like COVID, and on the surface, it appears to be a pandemic, some sort of random, unforeseen circumstance that is currently putting a lot of people's lives at risk, um, unfortunately. But often, as the case with science, once we begin to explore the problem in um, deeper detail, we see that the risks were foreseeable. It's often that the institutions charged with overseeing risk and responding were blinded in some cases by forces that we would regard as rather malevolent or illicit. So, we've seen that a lot of the commentary that's coming out about the structural forces underpinning the pandemic have really looked at understanding the um, erosion of the environment, the increasing destruction of ecosystems, the expansion of agro-industrial practices on a global scale, and how that's rendering populations more vulnerable to the exposure to these kinds of fast-spreading illnesses. We've also seen that the COVID outbreak is raising questions about how we allocate our social resources, how we how we allocate wealth. And wealth is largely allocated, or increasingly so since the 1980s, through the market. And it's used by private actors, and more wealth is used by private actors because taxation has been dropping and dropping and dropping. And they're choosing where wealth is to be applied. Sometimes it's sitting in offshore accounts and is not being applied at all. Sometimes it is being applied into ends that have very few socially productive consequences. So property speculation and financial speculation would be examples of that, both of which are plagued by illicit practices, I might add. And that means that wealth is being siphoned off from the democratic sphere, where it can be applied in a thoughtful manner to counter many of the endemic problems that are facing humanity: disease, illness like cancers, and diseases like cancers that are being exacerbated by the reduction of regulation around pollution and toxic waste. We are also seeing our capacity to fund infrastructure reduced. And again, this isn't something that's removed from criminology. In criminology, we're trying to understand how we've seen increasingly, both in places like the United Kingdom and abroad, how the democratic sphere has been corrupted by power, by money, by undue forms of influence, and that has seen wealth increasingly shift from the public space to a private space through illegitimate means. We've also seen, both here and abroad, that because the democratic sphere is being increasingly corroded, that we've seen our ability to regulate how we engage in global industrial capitalism is being increasingly decimated, which means that that's putting environments at risk, ecosystems at risk, it's putting public infrastructure at risk, and that is lowering our resilience in situations such as the current crisis. And so really, as a criminologist, we are, particularly for criminologists who are interested in the crimes of the powerful, we're really interested in how, in the post-COVID period, we begin to have an audit of these critical structural problems that have emerged largely, or in particularly in a very amplified manner over the past 30 years, that has left large swathes of the world vulnerable to diseases like COVID, that have left the large swathes of the world vulnerable to analogous longer-term types of pandemics, which you could class climate change as, and how that's linked to the corrosion of democracy, how that's linked to deregulation, how that's linked to incidences of corporate and state crime, and what we can do as a concerned public, and hopefully an increasingly unified public, after we've seen that these kinds of issues don't discriminate regardless of gender, age, or class. That though certainly, people of a certain age and class are much more vulnerable to the lethal effects. That we begin to develop a response that begins to put wealth back in the hands of democratic structures, that we begin to plan in a long-term basis. We begin to use our social wealth to tackle the big social problems that face us, our children and our grandchildren, and that we do so in a manner that roots out a lot of the illicit forms of influence that decimated our public policy and public administration structures.